Okay, so here we are once again. It is 11:30 on a Sunday, which is the time that we meet here, California time, every weekend. That's very confusing, probably a bad start. We're here every Sunday, 11:30 California time. We're probably only going to go for maybe about an hour and a half today. It depends, because I'm having less and less time for things. But can I trick or treat some diaphragm? Nice. Yeah, I mean, we can. I don't think I have anything particularly new for you. There might be a couple things. Definitely things I can share with other people that I haven't really talked about much on the channel. Hello, King Lion. Welcome. As far as the diaphragm, what I would recommend is just like go look up how to sing. Because singing, I think in all languages probably, but especially in English for sure, there's lots of diaphragm stuff. Also, if you're acting on like a stage play, they talk about projecting and speaking from your diaphragm. So, I mean, at some point I might add something for that in the course of everything, but it would be a very minor point. And there's probably plenty of really great resources already available on YouTube or elsewhere online that can actually teach you how to use your diaphragm more effectively for English breathing. I'm still not sure how to use it. Also, is vibration low in the rib cage a good thing since it's not past it? And that's a bit questionable. I've been messing around with these a lot. I don't think that there's a like let's say if you were to take a ruler and put it up against like your the front of your body, it's like, oh, you don't want to go past the 5th inch or something. Like I don't think it's that pinpoint necessarily. And it's probably going to vary from person to person a little bit as well, because there's differences in various things, how people speak. Obviously, if I speak louder or more quietly, there's going to be more vibration that resonates up and down. And then like there's slight differences in the shape of the vocal tract or how it's held between person to person, even among natives, right? So there's little differences here and there. No, I mean it's low behind the rib cage, but not like past the rib cage, the joint we talked about. Just gonna clarify that. Yeah, well, regardless, so as I told you before, for everybody else who's here, we're talking about like resonance and breathing from the stomach, not speaking from the chest, breathing from the stomach. It's a minor point, but when we talk about, because the resonance should generally be back here, like in the back of the mouth. It's not in the chest. It's not, obviously your vocal cords vibrate here, and that's technically where the source of everything comes from. But depending on how you shape things and move it around, you'll feel the primary vibrations in different spots. Now, when I'm talking about like, okay, so how low down do I feel the vibrations? Because they're like up here doesn't mean they don't resonate, right? Like there'll still be like resonance in the front of my mouth. There'll still be resonance in the butt and in my chest or whatever. It just depends on exactly what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. What's the primary placement? So if I'm just speaking normally and I have my resonance primarily sort of back here, sort of back half of the mouth. Let's see, if I'm just talking here, I put my hand on my stomach, below the rib cage, right? Do I feel any vibration? Yes, I feel very, very slight vibration. Hello, test. If I am not touching any of the bones of the rib cage, I feel almost nothing. Right, I feel almost no vibration on the stomach itself, and that could be for various reasons. I mean, there's body fat and things like that. Bones, right? They're kind of hard. They're going to vibrate more easily, I guess. But if I feel anywhere from like the bottom of the rib cage around the edges, right, the ribs, bottom ribs, I'll feel vibration all through there, like little vibration. So as for going past that, I mean, you're probably not really going to feel anything anyway. You could, like, you could intentionally try to get it down into your stomach, but you're probably going to mess some things up if you do that. The cat reveal. She's there by the room splitter again. Yeah, is she back there? Yeah, that's her spot right now. I have a I have a pair of shorts that like I wore once, and then I set there because I was going to wear them again, and then she started laying on them, and so I just left them there. So she's been laying on my shorts. But I would say the breath or air for the American English sound goes together with the vibration behind the rib cage. Well, I wouldn't specify behind the rib cage. I don't see there's any need for that necessarily, but I see what you're talking about, like because of the breathing part. I would say that it does seem to me that the way that like part of the residence is coming from or affected by the way that we breathe. And it's really, really strange to me because like talking with like there's one Russian speaker in particular that I'm working with, and not to single that person out or anything, but it's just it stood out a lot to me where she first brought this to my attention that like she doesn't there's no tension in her stomach when she speaks. She doesn't really feel any vibration like down here very much, and I was like, well, that kind of makes sense because of how she sounds. And when she tries to actually like breathe from the diaphragm and get the resonance in the right place in the back of the mouth, she actually immediately sounds better. She sounds a lot clearer. Even if there's no specific change to the sounds that she's making, it just amplifies how good she sounds. So that's one piece. It's like a 1% piece. There's several 1% pieces that I've discovered that like if you don't have them, you might be like 95% perfect, right? Like in terms of making the sound and general posture and stuff. But then there's like this little piece and that little piece and that little piece that once you add these extra little pieces, you get additional 1% to get up to 100% perfect. And the way that you breathe seems to be a 1% piece, maybe a 2% piece. But either way, no other questions today apparently. Let's see, or no other people asking questions. Anyways, to sum it up, I want to try singing and more attention to how the diaphragm works. I mean, we can still argue on what's perfect, but I naturally know what's off. Let's be honest. Yeah, that's fine. It all comes down to your own experience. I'm just a guide, right? That's literally all I am. I'm a guide. Any good teacher is just a guide. So regardless of how this person would describe it or how that person would describe it, it needs to come into your experience. So loud noises. But yeah, definitely try singing. As I said, I think it's probably more or less universal. You can look up, even if I know in your particular case, like you don't really care about your native language, you're just like pretty much completely English at this point. But I do think it would still be worth looking up like how to sing in your native language, or how to use the diaphragm in your native language, because there's probably, at least for singing, there's probably going to be some information there. And because it's based on your native language, the people who are teaching you are going to specifically say, oh yeah, there's this thing that we do and we need to remove that, or there's this thing that we do and we need to add that, or whatever it is. So it's going to be more tailored, where if like you watch, say, like how to sing for English speakers, it's going to help a lot, like it's probably all you need, but it's also going to be biased towards English speakers because there's going to be certain things that are maybe taken for granted, based on how English speakers speak. So just a little extra thought there. Which, by the way, so I know you change your name a lot. You made a comment the other day like you're the biggest troll on the channel. It seems like a troll name. It really does. I know you're you're a member, obviously, and whatever. But like everybody else, they're just like, who is this guy? Like that seems like a person who shouldn't be here. But then you're asking all these legitimate questions. So like, anyway, there's nobody else here. Why is there nobody else here? We're just dead. That's okay. I mean, we're probably gonna have to leave earlier today, as I said. So if people don't get here, people don't get here. It is what it is. It's not a troll, actually. It's wait, it's who I'm talking about. You are you an it, or you mean the name? I don't know. I don't care. Um, yeah. I thought it was funny and also felt that way. Also, it is weird that people aren't here today. Yeah, the beginning can sometimes be slow. I mean, although by now it's already been 10 minutes. Usually we have more people in here. Better focus on more finances, I guess. Yeah, everybody's out working. No time for live to watch the live stream because everybody's working. I thought it was funny. Yeah, I don't know. I guess the name can be kind of funny. It depends on how you look at it. When I first saw it, I was like, "Who the heck is that?" I was like, "Oh, yeah." I actually, because I was checking, I had a new member join. There's now another elite English hacker who just joined, so you're not the only one anymore. But yeah, he is. I went to the memberships and everything. I was looking at them, and then I saw your name, and I was like, "Who the heck is that?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, it has to be the person who's always changing his name." But anyway, go away. What do I have over here? Okay. Yeah, they better retire me or replace at this point. And anyway. All right, so we're just here. What else can I talk about since there's nobody here to answer questions for? Um, the beginning of the live streams are always probably like the worst for people. They're just like, yeah, I'm just gonna skip this. Do 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 do. Hey, look, a troll comment that got through that I didn't even get notified about. Report. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Always got to do the moderation in the comments. Surprised YouTube didn't catch that one. Usually does a pretty good job of that. One thing I could address, we have some recent comments from a particular person who seems to only want to criticize my content, which is fine. So from Mr. S, why aren't the comments not loading? Oh, my internet's working. So one thing, we're talking about kit and kid, and us is on the vowel length lesson. And I think he said kit and kid happens automatically, and I think he was referring to the part where I was talking about kit and kid, obviously. But I was saying that it's like tenths of a second difference between going into the T or going into the D. And he said it happens automatically, like the difference happens automatically. It's like, well, yeah, technically, but number one, it depends on what language you're coming from. That might affect things, especially if you actually do have vowel length in your language, unlike English. And I can always reiterate and clarify this. I see we get some more things coming in here, so we'll get to that. I want to finish this really quick because it's important to reiterate. In the vowel length lesson, I had some text over it. I said there is a difference between vowel length and like kid, and I put, or at least a difference of some kind. And that's alluding to something else that I talked about before. For various reasons, I didn't think it was best to fit it right there because I thought it would. I probably should have added it, but I didn't. I won't go into all the reasons why, but the point is that what's actually happening. And I had someone leave a comment on this, and I was like, "Yes, you're absolutely correct. I completely agree." When you go from say kit from the I to the t, or kid, going from the I to the D, what's really happening is as you're going from I into T, all vowels are voiced. So we're going I, which is voice, there's voice coming out. As I go, if I'm closing into the D, right, it doesn't take me any longer to go from I to the D or I to the T because they're the same position, right? So the only difference, it's not that, oh, we magically make the I a little bit shorter because there's a T after it. No, as I close into that position, if I hold the voice all the way through the position, I'm going to get a D sound, even if I stop it. It's going to be, we're going to catch it in the nose, kid, kid, kid. There's that little there. And that's going to be interpreted as a D. The only way to avoid that, if I'm trying to say kit with a T, if I don't push it out, especially if I'm stopping it, the only way to really do that is to actually, uh, I have to end the vowel before I get to that point. Now you can say, well, you're changing the vowel length, and technically that's one way to look at it. I don't think that's the best way to look at it, whether that is true or not, because then that leads to all other sorts of problems where like you're trying to change the vowel length, you're trying to affect the vowel length and all this stuff, and it's like, no, that's not. In this respect, Mr. S, I think his name was Mr. S, is right. It does happen automatically. But it's not a changing of vowel length necessarily. It's just a byproduct of the fact that you're going into a voiced or a voiceless consonant after the vowel. And you have to stop the voice of the vowel before you get there. Like, that's all that's happening. And it has nothing to do with vowel length or anything like that. So anyway, okay, so we can come back to where we are here. Talk about content updates. I don't really have a whole lot of updates, but I can come back to that. I kind of picked up that you can hear a lot of the core through speech and hear it if you tune your ears in. Oh, I do have one interesting thing that I haven't mentioned to anybody except this one person that I recently met with in a consultation, but it's way harder as an adult, and you eventually get tired, like with the mouth posture practice. Yeah, if you tune your ears, especially like the interesting thing is the more that you develop the pieces of the core, at least in my experience through Spanish, the more that you actually hear, like it's so amazing. Ever since I started trying to develop more of a Spanish posture, even though it's still pretty much just in singing, like it's really hard for me to hold in speech, but it's kind of easier to do a bit in singing. Getting the the anchor is really difficult, but that aside, just going through that, like the more that I really listen, it's amazing because I've been able to understand Spanish for quite a while now. Like it's been maybe like 7 years ago, almost 7 years ago now, that I stopped actively learning Spanish, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, it was the end of 2015. I stopped really trying to actively learn Spanish. And so I still understand things. I'm a little rusty, but I've been listening to Spanish for a long time. And just in the last like 6 months playing with Spanish posture, my I'm able to hear certain qualities of Spanish sounds and just the flow of Spanish speech that my ears never noticed before. Even my ears, which are generally pretty good, like higher than average. Um, and so that's the thing. Like when you start getting these pieces and you start paying attention to some of these physical details, it can actually become a feedback loop into your ears where you actually start noticing, oh, I didn't notice natives do that because I still had this sort of English mouth posture filter on my ears. And the more I try to build that Spanish posture, the more I'm actually, and it's not a big difference. Like obviously I understand the language. It doesn't sound like English to me, but there's these little tiny details where I'm like, oh, there's this sort of little Spanish quality to it that I never quite picked up before. So it's pretty interesting. Like even just like learning to hear the language through the lens of posture is just like a huge boost to getting into the language, feeling the language, improving your listening. All the more reason to like start with mouth posture, not just pronunciation, but like day one, start looking at mouth posture when you start learning a language. Anyway, that apparently helped me a bit with the resonance, maybe top chest stuff. Okay, so I guess I was back to the previous thing, hearing the core. Yeah. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe. I have a question, to be honest. seems weird to put, to be honest there, but my friend said I speak nasally, which isn't common for Russians, in my opinion. Do you know how I can fix that? Yeah, so actually, the interesting thing is, well, I've actually worked with more Russians than any other particular group over the course of my teaching, just for whatever reason. It just happens that way. I end up with a lot of Russian students through italki. Um, but through mouth posture specifically, at least half of them also, it seems to be pretty corresponding. At least half of you guys that I've been working with are Russian, maybe Ukrainian. Usually that there's both, right? It's like Russian and Ukrainian if they're also a Ukrainian speaker. But um, the interesting thing is that it depends a bit on the person, and it's not like a huge big thing that immediately stands out. But I've noticed as I work on mouth posture with Russian speakers and even Ukrainian speakers that there is, compared to English, there is excess nasality. It seems that the way that Russian, like your default nasality, sort of like, if you're not doing like an N sound, like how much of is generally going through the nose. Russian isn't, in my understanding, it's not particularly nasal. It's not like a super nasal language. But if you compare it to English, there is a little extra nasality. And this is actually a problem I've had to deal with almost every single Russian student that I've worked with on mouth posture, where we reach this point where it's like there's something a little off, and I can't tell what it is. And then I say, well, let's try the nose. Let's try to make sure like we close off that nose a little bit more and let it go through the mouth, and they sound clearer. So don't be misled, right? Because it's relative. Just because Russian isn't a nasal language, right? Like say like Portuguese or French or whatever, doesn't mean that like the way that you hold things in Russian works in Russian. But especially, I've actually had Spanish speakers do this too. Spanish is more of a very closed mouth language. When you go into American English and you start opening up more, the nasal flap back here can actually open up too much with it. Right now, you do generally want everything to kind of come down a bit, but if you let the nasal flap itself, the passageway into the nose, not just the soft palate, but the actual full passageway into the nose, if you let that come too loose, then you start sounding more nasal. And so it's a little tricky. I talked a little bit about that, I think, in there was an exercise in like phase 1. It might have been phase 0, but I think it was in phase 1. I had an exercise towards the end of that lesson trying to address the nasal part. And I mean, there's probably other things you can do. At the end of the day, you want to become familiar with opening and closing the nasal flap, like what that feels like. And the best way to start with that is to like do say like an n or an ng, right? Where you're just like using maybe the lips or the tongue in different ways to like close. You can even just do this, like like have your mouth closed, let it go through your nose. And then what I find is useful is like if your mouth is open, right? So your mouth is closed. Clearly, it's going completely through the nose because your mouth is closed, right? It has to go through the nose. So it's open. And then if you open your mouth, but you try to let it still go through the nose. Some of it's going to go through the mouth, but if it mostly goes through the nose, it'll sound very nasal. So if I do like, it's very much up here, and I can feel the vibration in the nose. Then if I go through the mouth, see in direct comparison, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I noticed. But if I just do, that might sound normal to you, even to me. Like if I don't have any comparison, I'd be like, well, I don't really notice. It doesn't sound nasally necessarily, unless you compare it to the non-nasal. So you want to sort of play with it, get used to, try to actually feel that nasal flap opening and closing and figuring out how you can make it like more or less nasal. At the end of the day, it comes down to experience. But aside from that one exercise that I mentioned, and again, I think phase 1, I don't have a whole lot specific to tackle that. But anyway, there's little muscles that you have to become familiar with. You can hear the American breath resonance, etc., through your sound, but not all of this automatically naturally adjusts for you, and you might have to adjust it manually. Excellent, I discovered that. Yeah, perhaps. I did improve a lot with it, but still a lot to master and practice. Just a cool thing. I got lucky. Well, good. Hopefully, if you're sounding better, you're sounding better. That's all that matters. For Zena, welcome. First, welcome. Yeah. What grammar do you think is? So a grammar question with grammar mistakes. Very nice. I don't mean that jokingly. Like that's good. It's ironic, but mistakes are good because you can learn from them. Other people can learn from them. So what grammar do you think is? And there's a reason why we have that. We can talk about that if you want. Is the most important to learn to hit the advanced level. So the rest of it's fine. Good. That's tricky. I'm going to make a general statement here that what I'm going to say can easily make some people think that they're doing things wrong, and that's not my intention. But especially if you come from more of a traditional background, you might get that feeling. In my perspective, all of the, and this is as a language learner and especially as a teacher, the course of grammar development and the things that you should generally focus on as you go from, say, beginner to intermediate to advanced, it's always from the biggest things to the smallest things. Most people make the mistake of getting caught in like the articles and the prepositions and all this stuff. And I do think that, like, say with the logical preposition approach, I think if you had that early on, it could be very, very huge and beneficial because it's a completely different way to approach building the grammar. But if you're trying to like learn rules and this and that and whatever, and like do like basic exercises, articles, prepositions, the small details are not very useful at the beginning. Because you have much bigger problems, right? Like if you can't say, I went to the beach at past tense, it's like I go to the beach yesterday. Okay, it's understandable, and that's bare minimum good. Like that's much better than nothing, and you should be willing to sound stupid in order to communicate. That's fine. But obviously it's not I go to the beach yesterday, it's I went to the beach yesterday. And so you learn from that over time. But that's a bigger point. That's grammar, conjugations, right? You get a big benefit from that specific point. By the time you reach the upper intermediate level, all major grammar points let me rephrase that. By the time you reach the end of the upper intermediate level, so like when you're really getting comfortable with the language, because that's what the intermediate level is in terms of speaking. Your listening might be good, but maybe your speaking isn't there. So if you get your speaking up to an upper intermediate level, you are comfortable. You still make some mistakes, but you're comfortable. You should know all the major grammar points by that, at least intellectually, and you should be able to use most of them pretty well. Now that includes things like conditionals, that includes like would, could, should, the subjunctive, which goes along with like the conditionals and stuff. So like if I were you, I would do that. So it involves the subjunctive, it involves conditionals, it involves would. So that's sort of that, I think, last level of big points. In order to really make the leap from, and this seems counterintuitive, right? In order to really make the leap from intermediate to advanced, especially if you want to get to like advanced, what we call the C2 level in the European framework, but like just C1, regular advanced, professional competence where you don't really make many mistakes, but you could use the language, understand the language for pretty much anything you want. C2 is just like above and beyond. It's like that's more like native, like to get to that advanced level, just that basic advanced level, the biggest points are the smallest points. because you should already know all of the big things by that time. Maybe you still have some trouble using some of those big points, but you should know about them. You should at least, as I said, conceptually understand them. Um, you should be able to use most of them pretty well. So then, in order to get from intermediate to advanced, you want to start focusing on details like prepositions, articles, any of the sort of, and it's still 80-20. You can still find things that are relatively bigger than other things, but you start getting more into the fine details. However, so that would be my answer, basically. Like, you need to focus on the small things. If you have any major difficulty with some of the bigger items, like say conditionals or stuff, like you still struggle making conditionals, you're not ready for the advanced level yet. You need to put in some more time for that. But in my opinion, if like the way this is still in progress, but I have many sort of little leads into this between like prepositions and articles and verbs and the things that are going on in my brain that have been going on over the last few years of how to approach grammar and language learning, and sort of trying to directly hack into the personality and build this subconscious network that a native speaker has. That can be applied from a very early stage. And not only does it make grammar more interesting, at least to most people, some people still don't like the approach. But it helps you learn so much faster and more relatively easily, like relatively fast or relatively easy. It's not a silver bullet. It's not just like, yay, I now know it. No, you still have to put in the work. Nothing just magically, happens overnight. But just the initial results from like the logical prepositions, like when I was building the idea, I was exploring it, I was testing it with some students and stuff. Just the fact that several of them, because not everybody got to a certain point, but the people that got the farthest, that got towards the end, or at least into the second half of what I was developing, they started spontaneously creating phrasal verbs that they had never heard or seen before. Sometimes it didn't quite work. The logic worked and the feeling was there, but it just didn't quite exist in English. And sometimes you're going to run into cases like that where it's like, yeah, it makes sense. It could work in the language. It's just not something we say. There are cases like that. It's a small number of cases, but you will run into cases like that. But for the most part, their use of prepositions drastically increased. Their comfort in the language increased, and again, phrasal verbs that they had never heard or seen before, they were spontaneously generating out of their own brain just because of the approach I was using to help them build the feeling of the prepositions. They were actually feeling the prepositions and building that subconscious network that natives have. And so the phrasal verbs were a natural byproduct of that. Okay. In fact, if anybody asks me how to learn phrasal verbs, I say learn the logical prepositions, because sitting trying to memorize a bunch of phrasal verbs and a bunch of definitions is not only extremely boring and generally not the most efficient, but it's if there's no other approach, it's better than nothing. But compared to the approach I've developed, not everybody likes my approach, and that's fine because not everything works for everybody. But for most people, it's stupid not to do it. It seems, because it's like, why would you try to memorize a bunch of things and then still not be able to use them correctly and still be sort of confused, not be able to feel it, when you could actually literally build the feeling and build the network in your own brain? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, a little rant there. Just focus on smaller details. So it depends on you specifically. I don't know what you know and don't know. That's why I give you that general guideline of like, if there's any really big major grammar points, cover those. But as long as you have those, if you really want to get to the advanced level, start trying to look at the smaller details. And I should also clarify, because what a lot of people think of as advanced is actually upper intermediate. And this is across skills. It's not just for language learning. The one thing that I've realized looking at different skills, and especially just my own experience with languages, is when you reach conversationally, right? Because there's your listening skills, there's your grammar knowledge. Knowledge isn't skill, but if we're talking about like actually using, performing, right? Using the skill, doing the thing, in this case, speaking the language. Um, if that is at an upper intermediate level, to an it could be, say, even the guitar. If your guitar is at an upper intermediate level, your guitar skills. If your programming skills are at an upper intermediate level, if your drawing skills are at an upper intermediate level, drawing maybe is a little bit special in some ways, which we won't go into, but usually across the board, what happens is, to an outsider who doesn't know that thing. So let's say, right, I learn Spanish and my roommate doesn't know Spanish, and they hear me talking to somebody in Spanish. Okay, let's say I only have an upper intermediate level. So I'm conversationally fluent. Yeah, I'm making some mistakes. I have some hesitations here or there. But to my roommate who doesn't know Spanish, or maybe just knows a couple words or whatever, I'm a master, right? Because they don't know, they don't understand what I'm saying or how I'm saying it, or, from a native's perspective, they don't know the mistakes I'm making. I don't know the mistakes I'm making necessarily, because otherwise I probably wouldn't be making them. Um, but that's the perception from the outside. And so what a lot of people think of as advanced or mastery is actually just upper intermediate. Um, and then from there, to really get to the advanced level, to really get more mastery over it, you have to jump into that. But I think there's a perceptual problem for like what a skill actually looks like when you can comfortably perform it. Because you would think, well, if I can comfortably perform it, I'm fluent. I have a mastery of it. But that's not necessarily the case. Mastery actually comes from perfecting the smallest fundamental details. And that's what most of the elite level people around the world in sports and in music and all this stuff do. They spend most of their time focusing on refining the fundamentals as much as they can. Where the intermediate learner, they tend to suffer from intermediate eyes, as I like to call them, where you try to overcomplicate things, because like coming from the beginner level, everything's new, you're absorbing so much, and then you get to the intermediate level and you're kind of trying to like use all this stuff that, when if you actually listen to natives, like we don't use all these complicated structures all the time. Like if we want to sound fancy, or there's something that like we need a particular structure to communicate that idea, or it's best communicated that way, yeah, we'll pull out some really fancy thing, or whatever. But a lot of the time, most of the grammar that you hear most of the time is going to be pretty basic, simple grammar. Like, we don't need to be using the subjunctive and conditionals every other sentence, and so that also makes it harder to learn, because you relatively get less exposure, you relatively get less chance to practice, unless you're intentionally doing some grammar exercise. But anyway, I think hopefully you get the point there. If that wasn't useful, let me know. That's fine. That was kind of a thing. I can maybe try to answer that better, but take that as you will. Keep in mind, guys, so I see Abdullah is here. Yeah, I'll get back to that in a second. Thank you. Can you tell me more about these 1%, 2% thing that people should do in order to sound perfect? Well, those are pointless if you don't have the core. And this is all within the context of mouth posture for the most part. So like there's the anchorage, like if you don't have the anchorage, well, so in my attempt to figure out the posture and teach the posture, as I said, there's a scientific paper that I sort of came across through one of my students, and everything that I had discovered up to that point was pretty much proven in that paper. And I've, in subsequent papers that I've looked at, I've seen some details reiterated. So I know I'm on the right track. I know, top of the throat is important. The tongue being pushed forward or not pushed forward. These details that I've been talking about for like, what's the posture, what's the core posture, center of gravity, all this stuff. Like there's even the term center of gravity I found in one of the papers. And I was just I came up with that myself. So that seems good. And that seems to be the biggest thing, right? Because obviously, like, I would probably find the biggest details first. If I'm trying to guide somebody and I say, well, do this, do this is how it feels in my mouth. And they start sounding better. They start getting, better sound. So I think the biggest points, the things that are going to give you the bulk of the accent or be able to just hit certain sounds correctly is top of the throat needs to be in place. So you don't want to be pushing in here. You don't want to be pushing in here, which I found Russian and Spanish actually does. They actually tighten here, not here. So you want to relax that, open that up. And as we talked about it before, there's sort of this little finger point here to help keep this open. So it's a little lower than many languages. Your language might not be held higher. Depends on your language. If you're a Russian speaker, then you do hold it higher. You sort of let that come down, let that relax a bit. Let it be more open. The Russian tongue apparently is neutral, so it's not like pushed forward. It's not pulled back. This is the way I've seen it in the literature. I have sort of an English bias. So I don't like to look at it that way, but it might be the best way to look at it. Spanish is pushed forward, Russian is neutral, and then English and German. English apparently is like the farthest back. And I maintained for a long time that you don't want to push the tongue back. You want to let it settle down and back as you open up the top. And for most people that I've worked with, that's perfect for that detail, as long as they can remember not to push the tongue forward. That's the problem that keeps creeping in. I have, since finding the literature, I have worked, some of the people that I've been working with, I said, okay, just to see how it sounds, let's try to take the back of the tongue and push it back a little bit, like actually push it back. Don't just let it settle down the back. And for like 2 people, that actually improved their sound, but for everybody else, it didn't. And so it might be a little bit of an individual thing, might be a little bit of a language thing, depending on, because if it's pushed forward in your language, that feels relaxed to you. So when you sort of try to let it go back and relax, you actually might not be getting it back as far as you think you are, and you're actually still holding it a little forward. And so actively trying to push it back a little bit might improve your sound. So whatever the specific actual thing is, we're focused on the sound. Sound is king, right? I don't care what the like. I have people ask me like, oh, if my tongue is like this, then it produces the S sound, right? It's like, well, I don't know. Are you producing an S sound when you do that? Like, that's all that matters, right? Do you get the sound? But anyway, so that's the biggest point. Top of the throat. Make sure the tongue isn't pushed forward, and then you have the center of gravity in the center, right? Okay. That is probably 70 to 80% of everything. Now, some of these other little details that I found that I have been further confirming as I try them on different people seem to also be very critical and very important, so much so that they're actually going to become part of the foundation, like part of the first thing that I teach. Phase 0 is, as I may have said before, is likely going to become it's still recommended for everybody to go through, but it's probably going to become more of a targeted, as needed set of exercises. So like, for example, if you have trouble getting the center of gravity here in the middle and you're like, then you might not have the tongue muscle to sort of get that in place. And so doing, say, the middle of the tongue down in phase 0, especially if this is closing up as you're trying to go down, that's a common thing that happens. And the phase 0 helps you sort of get this down while holding this open and actually directly practicing that without worrying about the sound itself. You're just worried about the muscle. So, but some of these other pieces, some of these 1% to 2% pieces, are actually going to probably become part of the foundation because they stop the tongue from floating. And what I mean by that is, so I think I was talking about this last week, anchorage. Okay, anchorage. And again, this can vary a little bit from person to person. There's not necessarily a scientific pinpoint, like everybody does it exactly this way. In fact, in the literature, they've found variation among people. But you want to have, with the sides of your tongue, contact with the inside corners of the top teeth most of the time. Okay, it can kind of come off. I actually have a visual that I can give you to help this, but in general, you want to maintain that contact. Okay, it's going to be around there, and it can kind of pull off and stuff. Okay, so that's one thing. Now that's a physical anchor. Now, apparently in French, I don't really know anything about French, but from the literature that I've seen, they say that French takes the front of the tongue, they anchor it here. And of course, it could probably come off depending on what they're doing, but it tends to sort of stay there. And that's part of their physical anchorage. And so I actually played with this a little bit. It's very interesting because French speakers, when they try to say the TH sound, of course, it's no wonder French speakers can't say the TH sound because their tongue is stuck here, right? They don't actually put it into place to say the TH sound. But that aside, when they try to say the TH sound and they're speaking English, right, they usually make it more of a Z. They say it's a voiced TH sound, right? So like Z instead of the. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is if I try to imitate a French accent and I do a Z like I would in English, okay, my tongue, of course, it's not going to be anchored here. It's actually going to lift up to, around the alveolar ridge bump, which is another of the 1% points that we'll talk about in a second. And it's going to be the SZ position. So the front tongue is actually going to be lifted. And now, obviously, there's other details of the posture that are coming into play, but that's going to be a significant difference compared to where the French person might be. Now, let's say, I don't know what a French person who speaks French trying to learn English. I haven't explored this detail with any of them because the last person I talked to who's a French speaker, I haven't seen for a while because he's a student and he's busy and can't always afford classes and stuff. So, hopefully I'll see him again, but I haven't worked with too many French people. But if it's true that the tongue tends to stay anchored here in French, when they try to do that TH sound, if I try to do that, so I anchor it here, and then I say, okay, I'm going to make a Z sound, what I know is a Z sound, to imitate a French accent in English, but I'm going to keep my tongue anchored here instead of lifting it to do a normal English Z, instead of saying Z, 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 as a day, right? Something, if I say like Z, 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 Z. So the tongue, the exact way it's going to come out is going to be a little different because obviously there's a little bit of a different shape here, but there's also probably other details of the posture I don't have in place. But if you listen closely, you can tell it's a little bit of a different Z. There's a little something different going on with either the sound itself or around the sound. And that probably makes it sound a little more French in a way. I don't know. I did try that little trick with one person who is not a native French speaker, but they speak French, and they did say that it sounded more French when I do that. So, okay. Another 1% thing, 1 to 2% thing. So what I like to do, basically what I'm developing mentally here, there's this sort of mental model of how to picture your tongue. So if we go from front to back, so there's front to back and there's side to side, okay? And we get this sort of 3D representation. So front to front, the front of the tongue, back of the tongue, it seems that roughly speaking, we can sort of create this thing where it's like, okay, there's a line past which the front of the tongue generally doesn't cross. It can, but it generally doesn't cross. And then in the back, there's a line that the back of the tongue generally doesn't cross and tends to sort of rest on. Okay. Now, if you speak English, that line is going to be back this way. And we see from the literature that apparently compared to other languages, the back of the tongue in English is sort of pulled back and the front of the tongue is pulled back from the teeth. So we have this sort of backward shift. Okay. Now, if you speak a language like Spanish, you're actually pushed forward back here and you're actually not pulled back from the teeth. You're more sort of, if not on the teeth, sort of like on the teeth line. So like say more lined up with the teeth instead of the alveolar ridge. And it's not pinpoint perfect. There's going to be little degrees. It's a small thing. Our mouths are only so big, but there's going to be more of an emphasis forward than backwards. So if we have these front and back lines in English, it's sort of like it's set here. In Spanish, you want to get it set here. Okay. And again, it's not necessarily a perfect one-to-one. Like I can stretch the front of my tongue forward without pushing this here, or I can sort of get this forward and still have this pulled back. That's going to affect different things. It might depend on the exact language. There's also this sort of up and down element that I haven't explored too much, but that seems to be a thing where it kind of corresponds more or less. And then in addition to that, what this line is, as I said, it likes to kind of rest on it. So if you're sort of here, you're not really going to push forward from that too much. Like you're not going to leave that. Now, if I go from English to Spanish, this is going to go up here. The whole thing's going to shift forward. And it's generally going to stay there in Spanish, where in English it's going to generally stay here. And of course, it can leave. It's not like a pinpoint thing. Just like in the front is a good example because when we do a TH or an L, you can cross that front line. And what is that front line in the back? Okay, you don't want to be pushing into the nasal flap, like into that soft palate where the uvula hangs down, the little ball. You don't want to be pushing into that because you got starts messing up the sound. You want to kind of be like straight up where you're sort of on there's like the hard palate that goes into the soft palate, not pushing into the nasal flap, but sort of just like right there at the beginning of the nasal flap, where if you kind of go back a little, you'll start to push into that nasal part. Okay, just like right in front of it. That's roughly the line in English. Okay. In the front, the line is going to be, roughly speaking, generally under the bump of the alveolar ridge. So that you have your top teeth right here, you have a bump here. You're generally going to be lined up, no matter how far you open or anything like that. The front of your tongue, the tip of your tongue, is generally roughly going to be lined up underneath that bump. Now, for sounds like E or I, you can actually be a little bit in front of it. That's fine, but you're not going to pass the line where the teeth go into the gums. Okay. Again, maybe there's a little variation there. It depends on certain details, blah, blah, blah. But in general, it's still going to be around that bump. Now, where we put TDN right here, t, d, n. If you have a push forward posture and I say, hey, your TDN is supposed to be here in English, but you don't fix your posture, now you're doing this. And what do a lot of English learners do? They end up sounding like da, da, n, or something like that. Or they'll be too flat and they'll be like da, da, n. They'll be like trying to push it here instead of here. So if you're pushed too far forward, you literally can't close this right. Like even if you put it on the bump, you can't close it right. Okay, that's why the posture is so important. But anyway, TDN is there. The S and the Z are around there. The sh and zh are a little bit pulled back, but we're still kind of in there. Talked about that last week. Obviously, we have like some back sounds and some middle sounds like or whatever. But in general, the front of the tongue, no matter what you're doing, even if I'm doing like k or ah, the front of my tongue is going to be roughly lined up under that alveolar ridge bump. Okay, again, pulled back from the teeth here a bit. So again, it can move. The TH and the L can go past that. It's fine. The E can maybe go a little past that, but you want to make sure you're generally in line with that bump. Now that gives you a guideline, a solid concrete guideline of, oh, my tongue should generally be within this range forward and back, right? So I want to, if my language is here, I want to keep it back here. And then side to side, we talked about anchoring on the top. Very, very lightly. Okay. If you try to hold that too stiff or you try to get it too tight, you're going to end up making a more of a closed sound. It's going to sound like you don't have enough space. Okay. But if you keep it loose, okay, you let it kind of come off. You're not really trying to anchorage is kind of a misleading term here because you're not trying to glue it to the teeth. It's actually more of a zipper. It's like your tooth is a cloth or your tongue is a cloth. The top, I'm slightly changing the way I've described this before. I used to say it was two poles with a string tied to it, but I think it's better actually to think of it as like a zipper. So this is like your top teeth are like one part of the zipper, and then the sides of your tongue are another part of the zipper, but it's a very loose zipper. And so this cloth is sort of like loosely zipped to your teeth here. And as the jaw opens, so you do have, say, a pull here and a pull here, these teeth, that will have a string going through the tongue, and it will sort of pull it down in varying degrees as you open more and more. So will unzip a little bit. Will unzip a lot, maybe even completely. But the tongue doesn't do this. The jaw doesn't open. No, it comes off this way. Okay. And so that way we can generally maintain that anchorage of the sides of the tongue throughout most of speech. That aside, where you resonate from is important. If you're resonating from here and you kind of sound a bit more like this, it sounds a little empty kind of, instead of more from here inside the mouth. It's a very subtle little thing. Or this is really hard for me to do. If I try to maybe talk a bit more from the front of my mouth, so immediately, like, I feel more tension in my lips. Obviously my sounds seem a little restricted and stuff because the resonance usually isn't up here. So, you want to try to make sure that your resonance is in the right place. Resonance is definitely a 1% detail. Most teachers seem to, or I don't want to say most teachers, but from what I hear from other sources, a lot of teachers seem to make resonance like the big thing, like, oh, if you resonate from here, it fixes all your problems. Like, no, it's a very small detail. The exact way that you're breathing and how much breath force you have, we know that that's a 1% detail. The nasality, right, is 1% detail. So we have sort of where the tongue is placed this way, where the tongue is placed this way, going side to side, front to back. That anchorage, the zipper, that gives you a solid framework that you can then sort of literally build the posture. And then you have to maintain the top of the throat, make sure the tongue isn't pushed forward, and get the center of gravity. So the top of the throat and the center of gravity here, that sort of creates the American sound within the context of those other details. But anyway, there's a lot. So I've spent a lot of time on this. I'm going to move on. But that should give you an idea of some of the things. And everything that I just talked about with like the front and all this stuff, like I'm giving that to you guys now. It's not completely formalized and finished. I'm still testing some things with people, but it is improving. And it's improving people's sound. When I make the content for that, there'll be information for that for you to refer to, but that's what I have for you at the moment. So yeah, Abdullah's here. Hi. Yeah. So this person here is the person who keeps changing their name. So you're already familiar with them, but it is a little weird. That's okay. Are you planning to make a stress video practice for the people who can't hear stress? I already have one. Probably not what you're expecting or looking for. Maybe you're already aware of it and it's not quite what you're looking for, but I do plan to make at some point some more like stress extra practice type content. But this is the main video for stress, and it seems deceptively simple. In itself, it may not be sufficient depending, but it's at least a starting point. You can go over it several times. But it's designed, it doesn't matter what the rules are. I sort of reference the rules a little bit, like, okay, nouns that, generally are stressed on the first syllable or whatever the rules are. It doesn't matter what the rules are. You can sort of get the patterns like that, but you want to be able to feel the stress and just like if I look up a word and I see what the stress is or I hear the stress, like I'm not going to misstress it. Very rarely would that happen. It was like a complicated word. So you want to be able to hear and feel the stress. And what this lesson does is it goes through lots of different patterns and things where you're literally just like listening. I mean, I think you can repeat also, but you're just like listening and like looking, and it'll visually show you what is the stress. So you have like visual confirmation to help your ears. But it's just a bunch of examples to sort of feed your brain the food it needs to hear the stress. And that is generally a useful approach in my experience. Thanks for your answer and correction. Advanced level seems to be so far from me. Every time I try to use complex structures, what comes to mind is German and go crazy about it. I can only think in German. Yeah, so that's a common problem. It's a common problem. So as I said, complex structures are actually more the domain of upper intermediate. But like even me in Spanish, again, I'm kind of rusty. I can use the more complex structures, but when it comes to like the subjunctive and remembering to use the right form and this and that, it's kind of fuzzy compared to the more basic grammar, because you literally don't get as much exposure to it. As I said, you don't get as much practice time with it. So yeah, it's tough. I'm going to find a way to help fix that specific issue, but that is not at all in my mind at the moment. So yeah, when it comes to thinking in another language, that's a different topic. But I used to be there too. It's way easier than you think. It just takes time and not as fast. The journey from advanced to above is way harder. Yeah. That's usually the case. What is it? A1, lower beginner, to A2, super small. Like you can cover that. Depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. But even if you take like traditional classes and stuff, you can get from A1 to A2 in like 6 months. And that's super slow. um, that's like maybe like a semester one. Usually I think semester one, semester two is probably going to be like A1 level. That's like way too slow and ineffective, but you know, you can get there relatively quickly. A lot faster if you know what you're doing. A2 upper beginner to B1 lower intermediate, bit of a bigger gap. Not too big, right? Like you can get into the intermediate level fairly quickly. Getting up to the upper intermediate level, especially in terms of speaking ability, bigger gap, harder to do, takes some more time. Definitely need lots and lots and lots of speaking practice for sure to get there, to build up that automaticity. But to get from B2, B2 is usually called the intermediate plateau because a lot of people get stuck there. Not necessarily because like things past that are too difficult. It's because they become too comfortable. That's usually the case. It's like, well, I can already communicate and understand, most of what I need to do. I don't need, this like ability to express myself in a super complex way or like, understand poetry or something like that. So like I can watch TV shows, I can talk to people. Yeah, I make mistakes, whatever. You get comfortable in the language. And so it actually becomes harder because not only is the gap bigger, but it becomes harder to get up to that advanced level. I'm going to find a way to target and fix that. In fact, I think I already have a way to target and fix that, but that's coming in the future. Sorry. Lots of things coming in the future. Lots and lots of things. Could you make, please? Could you please make? um, yeah. Could you please make clear? You don't want to break making clear because it's like one idea to make clear or to make something clear. Yeah, you can put the something in between it. That's fine. But you don't want to put please in between it. Please is a foreign part of that. It's not actually part of the phrase. Could you please make clear what's different? Yeah, see, it's these little details. There's multiple ways you can say this. I'm just going to fix it one way. Could you please make clear what's different between these two question forms? Okay. Do you have you got? I always hesitate which one I should use in making a question with have. Okay. Good question. So if you're learning American English, British English, it's a little bit different. It's a little looser. I'm not an expert on British English, but I can definitely speak to American English. In American English, okay, so we know that when we make the question, right, you have the subject and the helping verb, or whatever it is, and they'll switch, right? So unlike, I think German, I'm pretty sure German still works this way. My German is fuzzy in my brain, but English used to just like switch completely. So it would be like, instead of like, do you make, like, oh, so if I say you make a cake, if I wanted to make that a question, it would be like, make you a cake? Question. And then the order, it's like, okay, it's switched now, it's a question. We don't do that in English anymore. So we'll have like, if I say I can do it, so can is a helping verb. Let me change do so this isn't confusing. I can go, right? Then we switch can and can I go is a question. So you switch it. Now there's this magical do in positive present tense, where if I just say like I make or I go, there's no do there, but it's still there. It's just we don't say it. I do go. And if you want to emphasize, you can bring the do back, but we usually don't. In the negative, it's there. I don't go, right? That's how you make the negative. So the do is there, and then it contracts with not. And then in the question, we say, do you go, or do I go? Do you go? Whatever. And it seems like the do magically appears, but it was already there, and it's still switching, just like it does throughout the entire rest of the language with any verb structure: would, could, should, future, past, perfect. It doesn't matter. It's just in the simple present, we usually don't say the do, right? So with have in American English, you informally, there are some structures or some set phrases that you can use with this, with like have you got or have you something. If you're using have as a main verb, not as a helping verb, not as the present perfect or the past perfect, but actually like I have a car, right? So it's showing my possession of the car or whatever. Or I have time. Okay. We do not switch that to make a question. So we don't say, have you a car? It sounds to me, it sounds British. It just doesn't sound good in American English. Again, there's some set phrases where maybe we can do that. But we don't really use have as a main verb in that way where it'll switch. Instead, we use do just like we do for everything else. And this is where it gets confusing because have is also used for the perfect tenses. And so it does switch, right? If I say I have done it, have I done it? You can switch it, but that's perfect tenses, not have as a main verb. So generally you don't want to do that. So right off the bat, the second option, I would say, like, unless you're speaking very informally, um, that's not even going to be an option. Okay. Do you have is the standard, whether it's formal, informal, whatever it is, like, do you have is the number one most common standard thing that you're going to do like 99% of the time. Okay. So I would completely ignore the other one because, as I said, even if the other one works, it sounds pretty informal. Like if I say, have you got any money? Sounds pretty informal. If I say, do you have any money? Sounds just normal. It's not formal or informal. It's just neutral. So that would be the easy answer to that. Don't move have around in the question form. That would be my general advice. So that takes care of it for you. Now you don't have to hesitate anymore. Just use the one. My native language is Hungarian, and we do not use to be or have words in our sentences 90% of the time. Okay, yeah, so that could be confusing, but that's how it works. Okay, Wendell is here. Hello, welcome, Wendell. I'm so behind. Sorry, guys. I take forever to answer things. I'm also probably gonna have to end a little bit early today. Instead of going to 2, we'll probably go to 1. Let me check something really quick. So Wendell has a question. There is a difference. So is there a difference? Right. This is a question. So is there? We have to switch it, right? It's like I was just saying with everything else, except for have, right? We don't want to do with have. We use do like every other verb. But if it's there is, make a question. Is there? They still switch, right? Yeah, I'm gonna have to go at 1. So let's keep that in mind. I know it's gonna be a little shorter today, but we'll try to finish this up. If anybody still has any other questions, feel free to ask them. But I may not have time to get to everything today. So is there a difference between the teachers group and the teachers group? How can I tell the difference between the two in oral language? Okay. Well. Two. 3. Okay. So you have 3 options here. You can say the teachers group where it's apostrophe S. It's teacher apostrophe S. That means either the group belongs to the teacher or the teacher is part of the group. Okay. So it shows that possessive. So it's one person who either owns or is part of the group. Okay. Very simple, very basic. Okay. Now, if you do this, you put the apostrophe after the S. So we have a rule in English for writing. Okay. If you have a plural possessive noun like this, so teachers with no apostrophe, right? Just one teacher, 2 teachers with an S at the end. Okay. That's the plural. So more than one teacher. But if you want to show possession, it already ends in an S or a Z sound. Because remember, it could be S or a Z. It's not always an S just because it's spelled with an S. But if it ends in an S or Z sound and you want to show that possessive, you don't write apostrophe S like you do normally. You just write apostrophe. Okay. Now, this seems to be something that maybe is kind of changing. People are maybe ignoring that a bit, but that still seems to be the clear standard. And that is what I recommend that you do if you're going to be writing, especially if it's something more formal. But even informally, it's just the normal thing to do. Okay. Now, the meaning of that is the same as the first one, except now we're talking about more than one teacher. So teacher apostrophe S group is a group that one teacher owns or a group that one teacher belongs to. The second one, teachers apostrophe. So there's supposed to be apostrophe S, but it's just apostrophe because that's how we do it in writing. Would be two or more teachers. So a group that belongs to two or more teachers, or a group that two or more teachers are part of. Okay, so now it's just plural. That's all you're doing. The pronunciation is the same. If I say the teachers group, there's no change. Now, in speech, in order to make the second one clear that it's plural, what many people will often do, you don't have to do this, but we will often do this to make it clear, is even though we only write apostrophe, not apostrophe S for the plural, we will say the apostrophe S. So the second case, you can pronounce the same as the first case, or you can say the teachers' group, which sounds really weird. um, I think we tend to do that a lot more with names. Like if I say Chris, because if it's like Chris apostrophe, okay, that's just one Chris, that's one person. But you wouldn't necessarily, I still don't think you would write apostrophe S. I think that breaks the rule. So it would still just be apostrophe, but then you could say Chris's car instead of Chris car. You could also say that if you're speaking really quickly. But so the match between the pronunciation and the spelling is a little bit different here. It could be a little bit weird. What we would actually probably say in this case, instead of the teachers' group, because that actually sounds really bad to me. What I would say instead, we would say the group of the teachers. So we would actually use the of structure instead because it sounds better here. Sometimes it'll sound good one way, sometimes it'll sound good the other way, but in terms of writing, it looks fine, and that's what it means. Now there's a third option. If you say the teachers group, this is something completely different where there's no apostrophe. That sounds maybe where it's like the title of the group, right? Or like the name of a company or something like that, where it's a group of teachers, basically. So it has nothing to do with possessive, whether it's singular or plural. It's just a group of teachers. So if I say the teachers group meets every Wednesday, that would probably actually be apostrophe S or S apostrophe. Yeah, it would be S apostrophe. See, I don't even know. It gets confusing in terms of the writing. I'd have to double check to be 100% sure. But that kind of, as I said, it sounds more like a title, sort of. So it does exist, but that one, it seems probably the least likely. But it would still just be the teachers group and pronunciation. It would sound the same. So how can you tell the difference between the two in spoken language? Context. And if the context isn't enough, ask for clarification, right? There are always cases in language where something isn't clear, even though you heard everything clearly. And that's not necessarily your fault. It could be the way that it was said, either could be interpreted more than one way, and the way your brain interpreted it was different than it was intended, which it just happens. Or it could be that based on certain little grammatical details when you hear it in the spoken language, in writing, maybe it's clear, but when you hear it in the spoken language, maybe it's not quite clear which one the person means. And so you have to just ask for clarification. We have to do that as natives sometimes. So pay attention to context, otherwise ask questions. I want to find an accent coach soon, but I don't understand how to, welcome, no name, but I don't understand how to recognize, no D, just recognize the different accents through America. So I don't know what accent I want to learn. What are the differences between accents? Okay. Should be able to answer this relatively quickly. I could easily spend a lot of time on this. So if we take, let me actually bring up a map here. Map of United States. Don't worry, we're gonna be talking about broad regions here. I'm not gonna go into like every single state. Okay, so this is a pretty decent map. Let me share my screen because I can do that now. Okay, present, share screen, and when I go to tab, this one, share. Alrighty, so here we are. Let me make this bigger. Perfect. Okay, so here's all the states. Now, you have the South, which goes generally from about Texas through probably Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. So from Virginia down over through Texas and then over here. So this whole region here would generally be the South. Florida, I think, is probably part of the South as well, but this is what we think of the South. So if you think of a Southern accent, in your case, you may not know what a Southern accent is because, as you just said, you can't really hear the difference. But this would be like country music. If you listen to country music, American country music, you're going to hear people talking a little bit more like this, where maybe their vowels are a bit longer, a bit more rounded in a way. There's a variety of Southern accents through this region, but they all sound in some way Southern, and they don't sound like general American. Okay, it's clearly an accent. We call it a Southern accent. Okay, Florida is the exception area here because most people from Florida sound pretty neutral. Okay. They do seem to have a little bit of a difference here and there, but they don't sound Southern. And it might depend on where, like maybe people from up here in Florida have a bit more of like an Alabama sound or a Georgia sound. I don't know. But in general, people I've heard from Florida, they don't really have an accent. They sound generally pretty neutral. Okay. So this region is one big region. So if you know the speakers from any of these states, there's a good chance that they have an accent. I met somebody from Georgia like a few months ago, and he had no accent. And it was a short little exchange. I asked him where he's from. He said Georgia. I was like, wow, did not expect that at all because he has no Southern accent whatsoever. So just because they're from here doesn't mean they'll have an accent, but there's a good chance that they probably will. Now, if we go through the middle of the country, which would be Oklahoma, maybe Upper Arkansas, Missouri, maybe into Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska. So in through here is like literally middle of the country. Some people have a bit of an accent. Most people sound generally pretty neutral. Okay, so there's sort of this sort of scale as we go north or northwest through here, where it starts to kind of sound more neutral. Up in, say, the Dakotas and Minnesota and maybe up in Wisconsin, it depends on exactly where, again, it's a range. But when you start getting into here, there's lots of speakers who start to sound a bit more like they're from Minnesota or from North Dakota, and they have a bit more of this type of sound in certain vowels. And they'll generally still have a pretty neutral sound. It's just some of those vowels really stand out, and you can tell that we would call that like maybe a northern accent, and that specifically refers to this region. There's also Canadians up here who have a very similar type of sound. Okay, so then you have, right, Michigan, probably Illinois a bit, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Through here, this is generally what's taught as the neutral accent. That is one neutral accent. There are also people in Chicago, Illinois, right? Chicago. That's not standard. I wouldn't say that's a neutral accent, but so again, it depends. There's also like, I think it's called the Northern Cities Vowel Shift or something that's happening like in Wisconsin and stuff, maybe Michigan. I actually know somebody from Michigan. She didn't have any accent. So again, it's going to vary a bit based on the speaker and whatever, but the reason it's called general American is because most Americans, even if there's a little difference here, a little difference there, most of them will have a very generally neutral sound. Okay. The regions that I'm pointing out, the South, the North, okay, probably in through here, those are where we start to get more deviation to where it's like, that's an accent. Okay. You also have obviously New York, New Jersey, the Boston area, Massachusetts. Okay. There's sort of this, I think it's like the tri-state area or something like that. But these three, New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, Many people will have something of an accent, especially if you have like more of a New York accent, which I'm not going to try to do because I'm horrible at it. Or if you're from Boston, right? It's get a cup of coffee, get in the car, get a coffee, or sorry, coffee, get a coffee and get in the car, right? So they don't have the R's at the end of their words in Boston accent. Like British people, so it's very clearly not general American. Um, I've heard plenty of people from New Jersey and from New York that don't have a particular accent. Like maybe there's a little something here or there, but they don't really sound like they're not neutral. They don't really sound like they're necessarily from a particular place. My grandma's from New York. She doesn't have too much of an accent. A little bit here and there, but up until like say 5 years ago, when I really started like looking at pronunciation and becoming more aware of how things sound, I noticed no accent. Now that I listen to her, I can hear sometimes in some words and stuff she has a bit of an accent, but she generally sounds neutral. So even a lot of people from New York are going to sound neutral. Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, a lot of people in here are going to sound neutral. And then you have the West Coast, right? Say from New Mexico to Montana over to Washington, California. This would include Alaska. This would include Hawaii. I don't know too much about Hawaii, but I think they generally sound neutral as well. Anyway, definitely Alaska and then all these states. Would be Western American English, which is under General American English. One of the biggest differences here is what we call the cot merger, where ah and aw become ah. It just becomes one sound. And that is something that also exists over here in Pennsylvania and has been over the last several decades, slowly been moving across the country to where now many speakers in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri are actually naturally speaking with that as well. And probably it's going to eventually become the default, which is part of the reason I teach it to you, because it makes your life easier. You still sound very neutral. Some people in Washington might have a little bit of an accent. They'll say wash instead of wash, which is something that some people in the South do. Some people from, let's say, like the Bakersfield area of California, which had a lot of immigrants from Missouri back in the 1930s and 40s, they have like the pin-pen merger where they don't make a difference between in and n. It's just like one. I forget which one it is, but it's just in, I think. So pass me a pin so I can write with my pin instead of pen. So there's going to be little regional differences here and there, but for the most part, most people from the West Coast or the western half of the country will generally sound neutral. Okay. Just like most of the people from here, most of the people from here, most people from here. The South is the really big exception region. And then again, even through the South, even through the North, even through, this area here, there's still plenty of speakers who don't particularly have too much of an accent. They generally sound neutral anyway. So the point here is that most speakers that you hear who are American, and even many Canadians, by the way, but most speakers that you hear who are American, as long as you know they're American, there's a really, really, really good chance that they are a neutral, general American sounding speaker. Okay. So, that is the general guideline. Okay. Now that means you have to know where the person is from, which you might be able to find out relatively easily. If you go to watch a YouTuber or something, they might say, oh yeah, I'm from this place or whatever. Maybe they've mentioned that somewhere. But that gives you sort of an idea, is like, as long as you know they're American, there's a good chance that they probably don't have too much of an accent, if any accent at all. Past that, I think I was explaining this to Chiggy before as well. Past that, there's nuances and stuff. If you want to be 100% sure, you'd have to get it verified by a native. So if you really, really want to, I can't do this for everybody all the time, but if you have, say, like a couple YouTubers or a couple actors that you like, that you want to listen to a lot, that as a reference, you can like leave a comment on this, later on this video or some other video, and say like, oh, does this person sound neutral? If you get like 2 or 3 parents that sound neutral, that's all you really need. And then you can just focus on like mimicking those 2 or 3 people. So I can verify that for you if you want. In fact, I should probably, on the website, like put together like a list of like, common sources or common people who have a general and neutral sounding accent. That way I could just point you there and you can do with that what you will. But just joined, yeah, a while ago. Sorry. It was like a half hour ago. I'm so slow, sorry. Actually, but yeah. So I'm glad that you're energetic as usual. Yeah, I seem that way. I'm really not. I'm dead from the neck up. Um, the energy drinks help. I won't go too much into that. Life is not nice right now. But do Americans love the sound R? Do you unconsciously emphasize it when speaking? I mean, if you compare the American accent to like a British accent, I mean, I guess you could say love. I don't know what you mean by love necessarily. Like, uh, it's American English is a rhoticized language. Rhoticized, it's rhotic, right? So, um, rhotic means right basically pronunciation of R's, right? So it's fully rhotic, meaning that if there's an R, we pronounce it. Unlike in British English, where if they say car, they say ca. So they're not pronouncing the R there. Um, so because of that, yeah, it seems like there's R's everywhere. Now I've heard some people saying, some researchers even saying, I guess that like there's a certain way that Americans hold the tongue that create a bit of like an R sound throughout the flow of speech, like just our general sound, which I would very much disagree with. I can kind of see maybe sort of how that could exist for some speakers, but and if you're comparing directly with or with British English, perhaps there's something in our posture that lends itself a bit more to a bit of an R sound. But if we had sort of an R sound throughout our speech, then that would probably make the the center of gravity. What is probably actually happening here, because is the center of gravity, but is the other central vowel, right? There's and those are the two central vowels. And so especially because in order to do the center of gravity has to kind of like get out of the way a bit, because it's taking over where the center of gravity should be. That might be the indirect contributing factor. I've heard people talk about like the front of the tongue, but it doesn't match how I speak. So that might be the contributing factor that helps give us a shade of an R type sound compared to say British English, which has a bit of a different posture. I don't know, maybe it's in there, but it would be a byproduct of the center of gravity that we have, and the fact that the R is also made in the middle. It wouldn't necessarily be something like, we're always holding an R through all of our speech or something, because we're always holding an through all of our speech. That's the center of gravity. Anyway, not fully formed, of course, it moves around, but that's mouth posture. You have pictures of tongue placement and where the center of gravity is, Hai Shua, in the video below link. Yeah, so it won't let you post links. Sorry, it just doesn't work. It's probably my Hai Shua lesson. The is in book. It's not actually a schwa, so nobody gets confused. But any material. So okay, all of the lessons for the vowels and consonants, like the whole big main pronunciation course has like over 100 lessons that I've spent most of this channel's lifetime making. The information in those lessons is correct. The information is, I don't want to put that. Some of the images and stuff that I use, they're not necessarily wrong, but there's an absence of posture because I didn't know about it, right? Once we start getting the anchorage of the posture and we start getting like the top of the throat in place and all these details, not only do a lot of sounds become a lot easier, like the becomes so much easier to form. Not only that, but there some of the visuals, some of the materials I made that maybe I would have presented them a little bit differently or changed some little details. Remember when you see like the mouth and stuff, like it's not necessarily a pinpoint thing. It's like, this is how it feels in my mouth. This is generally about where it's going to be. That doesn't describe like the exact tension necessarily, right? I try to describe that to you in the lesson, but if you just look at an image and you say, oh, okay, it's here on the tongue, that just sort of tells you like, okay, I kind of know where it should be, but that doesn't tell you, okay, what's the exact tension? What is the other part of the tongue doing, right? Because we're not focused on the rest of the tongue. We're not focused on the posture. And so it's the lessons that I've made before, although they have helped many people, and although I still think they're perfectly great lessons, they're not complete in the sense of they're missing the posture. And as I go through the mouth posture course, and we address all those sounds again, the posture is going to be built into them. So I don't know if you had a question based on that. But yeah. Thank you so much. You're welcome. I'm looking for something like minimal pairs for stress. Do I have minimal pairs for stress? I don't think so. Sounds like something I would have, but I don't think I do. By the way, somebody asked, I don't know if it was Abdullah, it was somebody was asking me about like R extra practice or something, and I said I didn't have any, but I do. It's actually 2 parts, plus the R colored ones, but just the basic R, I actually have 2 lessons for that. It's in the main course. It just didn't come up in my search when I looked for it before. But anyway, yeah, I'll add that to the list. That's actually good. As I said, I'm going to be making more like extra practice, stress things and minimal pairs, like extra practice, minimal pairs. They kind of like they go together more or less in my mind when I think about the content. Like they're 2 different types of things, obviously, but it's more exposure. So I'll add that to my list. My never-ending growing list of. I probably have over 500 lesson ideas at this point. It's ridiculous. Not all of them are for pronunciation. Stress, minimal pairs. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to have to go. Thanks for tips. No problem. Yes, thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the role of the soft palate and the posture? Sounds like it might be a very important piece in getting the resonance sound just right. Yeah, I've had some students. I've had a Russian student where for some reason the soft palate stays up, and when she adjusts everything down, it creates a bit of a weird sound. I'm not an expert on that. It's a piece that I haven't explored too much. It does seem that when you're going, if you have sort of a more closed language, everything, when you go into American English, everything opens. So the soft palate will come down, the tongue will come down, the jaw will come down, the top of the throat will come down. Like everything just sort of comes down a bit. How much, right? And that's also tricky because if you get that too loose, you're going to start sounding really nasally. So you have to make sure you control the nasal part of it so it doesn't become too nasally. If anything, I would definitely say it's a 1% point, like I was talking about earlier. It's another 1% thing. It's not going to be a core big major thing. Will it prevent you from getting 100%? Possibly. So it would be like a 1% thing. It's a little extra detail that you might need to get 100% perfect. It could be James or James. Yeah. I'm pretty sure we can write both ways. I think you're supposed to write the second one. And then in terms of pronunciation, we will tend to pronounce James's, but it's probably supposed to be just James. Like that's James Carr. Yeah. Is it not difficult for English native speakers to pronounce the Z sound at the end of the word because since it's not the plural S ending for voice, what? To pronounce the Z sound at the end of the word because plural S. Oh, I see. Okay. Sound is king. Okay. It doesn't matter if the S or Z that you see at the end of a word is on a plural noun or not. What is the last sound in because? It's a Z. The E is silent. It's just spelling. It doesn't matter that it's not a plural noun. It works by the same rules. It's not, oh, plural nouns have this thing going on. It's like, well, that's a very common example, but S's at the end of words are very commonly Z's, pronounced as Z's. It doesn't matter what kind of word it is. Okay. So, but no, it's no difficulty for us at all. Well, I want to start to improve my English with you. Do you work? Yeah, I work through italki. The only other way would be to become a channel member at the highest level, Elite English Hacker, which is $50 a month. You get a 1 hour meeting with me. Among other things, you also get like all my ebooks. You get some feedback throughout the month, but you get a 1 hour call with me, which you could split into like 2 half hours if you wanted or something like that. But that's $50 a month, so not everybody can afford that. Otherwise, you'd have to work. If you want to actually like work with me, you'd have to go through italki. Yeah, there should be a link in the description for that. Do planes versus roommates. What? Oh, I guess, yeah. You can probably hear my roommates in the back. Showing the word, then something's hello from Tunisia. Welcome, thank you. Yes, thanks for stopping by. I really have to go. I'm just trying to like finish up here. Showing the word, then showing the stress will help us. I get. Well, did you put that twice? Why did you put that twice? Oh, then something is. Oh, I see. It was a typo. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There'll be something for that eventually. Can you talk about the different spots in the mouth where one can create the sound for the letter Z and which one is correct? Also, the sound for the letter G, please. Okay. So. Thank you for answering my question. Okay, so thank you. You're welcome, Chiggy. So this is gonna be the last thing I answer because I'm gonna have to go. Thank you for the question and for stopping by Rhapsody. You have to get the mouth posture. You have to get the mouth posture. You have to get the mouth. Like at this point, it doesn't. Anybody can ask me about any sound, and the first place I'm gonna go is mouth posture. If you don't have the posture, there's a chance maybe you can get a sound correctly, especially a consonant sound. But there's also a very good chance that either A, it's going to be a little bit off. It's not going to be 100% perfect if that's your goal. Or B, going in and out of that sound that is perfect is not going to work very well. Like your accent's going to come back because you don't have the right posture. Okay. The Z, it's not pinpoint. The Z is generally, so you have the teeth right here. You have the bump, alveolar ridge. Okay. This bump here. The Z and the S are generally right under that. Okay. Now there's a little bit of a shape to it. I've talked about this in the lesson for the S and the Z. You can go look up, like type in English hacks, S sound or Z sound. I have a whole lesson specifically for the S and Z sound and how to form it. But there's a shape to it. There's all this stuff. There's a placement. And that lines up with what I was talking about earlier with mouth posture, how the tip of the tongue will generally be lined up under the bump, no matter how open the mouth is. Okay. So if I were to say close the S or Z, which S and Z are the same position, if I were to close it, like if I try to go straight up with the tip and close it, I land right on the bump, just like T and D. T, D, N, Z, Z. Maybe a little bit forward, and I'm kind of bending it in this way as I try to close it, but it's roughly pretty much right under that bump. Okay. What's really going to affect the sound a lot more is the exact shape that you're using. So that's probably going to be more important for the Z. But if you're pushed forward here, if your native language posture has your tongue pushed forward, like say in Spanish, then you try to do the Z from here. Z, z, z. The Z sound might still sound very Z-like. It still might sound great in itself. But then if I say I don't know, because I want to, if I say like because I'm leaving from this point, it's like things are off, things are out of place. Okay, even if I'm not changing the posture here, I'm just trying to get this more forward. It's off. So the sound is king, but sometimes sounds will still sound good enough, or as far as your ears can tell, maybe even perfect, despite the fact, again, this usually doesn't work for vowels, but for some consonants at least, it can sound good enough to where you think you're doing a good job, but your posture is actually off, and that's causing other problems outside of the sound. For k and g, same position for those two sounds, not for s and z are up here, k and g are back here. You're using the back of the tongue. You want to go generally straight up, more or less. Depending on if you're going into like after, you can sort of like push forward, get a little flatter. There's little details, but for the most part, you're going to go straight up. Absolutely do not push into the nasal flap. Don't go this way. Okay, same for k, g, they share a position. Okay, you're going to go up. Don't push into the nasal flap. If your tongue is pushed forward and you're up here, like I can't show you that, but if you're like k, g, it's going to be off. Okay, you want to be up. So the tongue posture by itself should already be down and back a bit. Okay, that's the first step. If you don't have that, that's a problem. Then you need to lift the back. Now, the other important thing is the center of gravity. This is the first part of mouth posture I discovered and that I was exploring. But there's the central tension that's always there in the middle of the mouth. That's why you'll often hear sort of like a schwa sound through the speech of Americans, like between sounds and stuff. It's because we're not holding as a full sound the whole time, but there's always this central tension pressure that all the sounds kind of move around. And so that's also part of the sound. Like I can't just talk about zzz without the center of gravity because it's a piece of it. If you don't have the center of gravity and you're too flat, maybe you're lined up right, maybe you have the shape right, but if you don't have this center of gravity tension, again, for that particular sound, maybe it'll sound okay. But going in and out of that sound, it's definitely probably going to sound a little bit off. So let's see if I do like, I don't even know if I can get rid of it. It's hard. Zzz, zzz, zzz. So there I'm trying to like flatten out my tongue instead of letting us have that from the anchor point, sort of a groove, central tension here. I'm putting the Z in the right spot under the bump. I'm getting the right shape, but I'm just sort of trying to make my tongue flat from side to side. Zzz, zzz, zzz. It immediately sounds less clear. It just because we don't have the space in the middle from that central tension. So the reality is that, all right, most teachers will say, okay, this is how you make the sound. And before I knew about mouth posture, I have a whole course telling you that. And those details are still useful and valid and important. But what most people don't seem to realize, and I didn't realize this before as well, so, not blaming anyone or anything like that, but there's an underlying mouth posture that every language / dialect has. British English has a different posture. And that posture directly affects the formation of the sounds. Okay. So before you even talk about where do I place the Z or, how do I shape the Z? Those are useful things to do, but if you don't have the right posture, I don't want to say you're wasting your time, but you're doing things backwards, for sure. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the full completed mouth posture course that I can just say, hey, go watch that. You can watch the beginning of it. There are some important pieces that I haven't published about yet because I discovered them more recently in the scientific literature. But all of that is coming. It's very slow, especially now that I have less time. But it's coming. I know. You guys have to be patient. I'm sorry. But that would be the Z and the G for the most part. I assume you mean G because you wrote G. When we think of the G sound, the letter G can also represent J. Maybe that's what you meant. But if that's the case, that's not going to be in the back. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Mouth posture and the core are the golden goose. Yes. Thanks. You're welcome. Mouth posture course expedite. Join the membership. Actually, to be completely honest, if you want to support the channel and get some feedback and guidance from me, definitely join. If your goal is to learn the mouth posture, just taking one lesson with me a month is not going to do it. At least not in a very efficient, effective way. It's going to be a lot harder. So I recommend if you actually want to work on the mouth posture, you take, at the very least one class a week, but even that is in my experience, very slow and like you'll make progress, but 2 lessons a week, 1 hour each are generally like the bare minimum to see pretty steady progress. So yeah, don't join the membership if your main goal is to improve the mouth posture, like, because I'll give you guidance and help on that, but you're going to be better served just taking classes directly. Anyway, I definitely have to go way over time. Thank you guys very much. Sorry, I have to cut this one short. Might be that way next time too, because I have to work. But yeah, have a great week. And I know I didn't really get too much out this week. I'm gonna try to get something out this week. I feel kind of guilty and bad about it. I got to make more content, but we'll see. So thank you guys and see you next time. And